Hello, and welcome to Climate Matters. I'm your host, Lyn Schad, and I'm a member of the Falmouth Climate Action Network. Climate Matters hopes to encourage climate conversations. Some will be easy, some will be tough. Have them with your friends, your families, and yes, even those with a different point of view. Let's help one another understand the impact of climate change on our coastal town. Together, we can plan for a more sustainable future for Falmouth. Join me in welcoming our guest today, Heather Goldstone. She is a scientist, she is a communicator, and a member of the Falmouth Select Board. Heather, thank you for joining us today, and welcome.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Tell me when you first started to think that climate mattered, and give us a little bit of your background.
Yeah, so I'll go back before, a little of the backstory before I actually got to climate. So I was about 12 years old when I decided I wanted to be a scientist. I'd already, I think, been in love with the ocean, but I had a summer camp experience on the Chesapeake Bay that was really eye-opening with regard to the environmental challenges that the bay was facing. And I came home and announced that I was going to become a marine biologist and save the oceans.
At the age of 12.
Yeah, you know, and simple things that you declare when you're 12, right, with complete confidence. So fast forward a bit, I kind of put my blinders on and focused on that being my goal all through high school and college, and wound up here in Woods Hole for graduate school, PhD in oceanography at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. And it was in the course of doing my PhD that I started to come to the hard realization that actually being in the lab and doing the science was not necessarily the best fit for me. And so I started thinking about what would other related paths be, because I was still really in love with the ocean and really in love with the idea that science could help us address some of these big environmental challenges. And so I walked up the road to WCAI.
That's a switch.
A little bit of a switch. I did come from a public radio family. My dad was a manager of public radio stations.
There.
Yeah, it was, you know, folks have since asked, like, why didn't you go to the local paper or to a magazine or try to write science? And the first time somebody asked me that, I literally stopped and went, you know, the idea literally never occurred to me. I thought journalism, I went to our radio station. And CAI was pretty new at that point, right? This was 2003. Mm-hmm. So offered my services as a science reporter. And
did CAI have sort of like a position towards climate change, or I would imagine the sciences, because they are right down there in Woods Hole, right?
Right, yeah, no, so there was no climate-specific position, and it wasn't necessarily that they had a science reporter position advertised, but given the very unique community that CAI is located in, even as a very tiny station, they had a science reporter on staff. That person had also had a PhD, was a scientist turned kind of science reporter, and she had just left for another job. Oh. And so I guess my timing was good. I didn't necessarily have a lot of experience in that realm, but they trained me. And
interesting that, I mean, you didn't have any prior radio radio experience. And here.
So I'd hosted a radio show in high school.
Oh, okay. Well, there you have it then.
Late night playing music with my friends. I don't think that really counts as journalism experience. And I had listened to a lot of NPR throughout my life. And at one point, like when I was actually preparing one of my first and recording my voice for one of my first stories, my editor said, wow, you know, it usually takes people a really long time to kind of get the hang of doing, like, voicing a story on the air. How did you do that so quickly? And I said, I just heard the voice of Cokie Roberts or Nina Totenberg, or in my head, and
all your
did what I thought they would they would do. So so that worked. And it was a few years later, I was kind of doing the reporting on the side. The station got a grant to do a series of stories about essentially personal profiles of scientists. So talking to 20 different scientists in our community and understanding what makes them tick and why they do the work that they do, which for me was just like, this is so much fun.
Yeah.
Right? Like get to go out with people on boats in Wacoit Bay. And
Oh, yeah.
like just, into their lab with them, and it was super fun. And then we got a grant for another series of stories that were around water issues. And as part of that series, we decided we should do 2 stories about climate change, one on fisheries, one on coastal resilience, essentially. And it was in particular the fisheries story, where I went down to the Northeast Fisheries Science Center and was talking to some of their scientists there. And they said, well, this is already happening. Already, half of commercially exploited species in New England's waters have shifted where they are found.
And this was about when?
And this was 2009.
2009, okay.
And I had this aha moment. I thought, well, I'm a scientist living in a science community. I thought I knew all about climate change. I thought I was being really forward thinking that of our 20 stories on water, we were doing 2 on climate change, right? I had no
There's so
idea
much
it was
more.
already happening. I still thought it was a future problem.
Yeah.
And if that's what I thought, then there's no way that anybody else knew what was really going on
So
with
you
climate
need
change.
to get the word out.
And that completely changed. So we submitted a grant application to write a blog about climate change, and for 18 months, I wrote a blog, multiple stories, I was gonna say a week, but it was multiple stories a day, cranking out, like finding stuff on the web and responding to that and learning the science and sharing what I was learning and doing more in-depth stories. And that started off as really my crash course in climate science, because the science I had been doing was not climate science.
It's like going to college. You learn so much in college, but then when you get out into the real world, then you don't always apply everything that you learned in school, because you're out there in the real world now and having that experience.
Yeah. And so I was getting up to speed on like what's the latest in climate science. But at the same time, so 2009, there had been bipartisan cap and trade legislation pending at the federal level, and it completely fell apart, right? And up until that point, yes, there were some partisan divides, but climate change was not a highly polarized political issue. It was President Bush who signed the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change Treaty, right? That cap and trade legislation was bipartisan. There were actually legislators working together, one from the Democratic side, one from the Republican side, on a book about climate change together. And it completely fell apart in that moment and became, or started to become, the polarized, partisanized issue that it is today. And I got really interested in why and how.
That was going to be my question. Like, why was that? What did you say? It was cap and trade agreement or something like that changed things?
So that cap and trade legislation, right? Cap and trade is basically the idea that the government would instate an overall limit on how much carbon pollution could be put into the atmosphere, and then those producing carbon pollution could reduce what they were doing, and if they were below their allotment, they could trade some of their allotment to others who are polluting more, right? So that you could have this back and forth to address an overall cap. And it was really a free market, a market-based approach to regulating carbon pollution. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse from Rhode Island will say that it was the Citizens United decision that injected a lot more money into this issue that really led to the collapse of that legislation, and this began this real partisan divide on climate change. There were, that's not to say there was no divide prior to that, but it was not nearly to the extent that it is, and it really started to get worse. And so I started digging into not only the climate science, but what at that point was kind of emerging psychology, social science about what's going on here. Why do we end up with some people who will accept the scientific consensus and others who reject the scientific consensus, not only on climate change, but on a range of issues? How does something like this become so partisan? And I got really interested in that, right? What's going on inside our brains and in our interactions with each other that would lead to this. And as a result of that, I then ended up starting a radio show after we ended that blog, because part of what I felt was, all right, well, people need to better understand the process of science and who's doing science, right? And this is a very timely topic at this point, in order to be able to trust the scientific information that's coming out into the public sphere and really start to integrate that into their daily lives. So that was kind of the goal of the radio show, Living Lab Radio, that I started and hosted for
Living Lab Radio, I've heard of that.
Yeah.
You started that?
Yes.
Wow. Wow.
So did that for about 7 or 8 years, and then was feeling like I wanted to do something, wanted to give more of my time to the climate change issue and kind of use what I was learning in that space as a journalist and use my voice in a different way, and shifted roles to work my day job, Woodwell Climate Research Center, and then a few years later, moving into our local political sphere, feeling like I had a lot that I had learned over the years and a lot of passion for a lot of the issues that our town is facing, whether that's coastal resilience, water quality in our estuaries and ponds, right? We've got a lot of issues where both scientific data and kind of a familiarity with working with data and trying to marry that with values would be a valuable way to approach a lot of these problems, and that's what kind of led me into
if I may say, also sort of that segue that you took into looking at what is it about human behavior that takes these different positions on difficult subjects.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely. And also over the period of the last 10 years, watching polarization not only on climate change but more broadly across a range of issues, and the toll that takes on our communities, and really wanting to be part of efforts to break that down and move things in a different direction where we can understand that yes, we have differences, but not let that prevent us from having conversations. I mean, I loved what you said in the introduction for this show, right?
Well,
like
having sometimes for this show.
Having sometimes difficult conversations, having conversations with people from different backgrounds, and trying to find where we actually have common ground, because I think we actually have a lot more common ground than we give ourselves credit for, and then we are told by those with vested interests in us in continuing to see us divided.
Yeah, yeah. And it would be nice for us to start as a community, maybe even as a world, to start thinking that way about what unites us, not what separates us. Because there's too many challenges out there. We won't be very effective if we constantly stand on either side of the issue, right?
Well, and I'll say conversations that I had when I was campaigning for Select Board, right? Regardless of where someone was on the political spectrum, if you live in the town of Falmouth, you see our beaches eroding. And maybe not everybody agrees entirely about the causes or about the path forward, but the number of people I talked to who said, we have to do something about surf drive. We have to do something about the heights. We have to do something about, so there is a shared concern. There is a shared desire to find a path forward. And so trying to start from that place of recognizing that we all love our beaches, we know that's why we're here and what makes our town special, and that we have to find a way to stop some of, or work with, find a path through what we're facing right now in terms of the loss of our beaches. And so, that I think that can get lost when we only focus on where we have disagreements.
And I think also change is very difficult for people to get comfortable with. It's not a comfortable place to be. But I think one thing that we can see, I hope, is that we are all experiencing some level of change. So that's like point number one, where we have common ground. So let's get together and talk about what the issue is, and give those, and maybe in some cases, opposing points of view, but with the spirit of, we want to come to a solution. We want to come to a solution and a plan of action for improving the situation.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we can say from a scientific standpoint that pretty much all of us share at this point is we have already been impacted by climate change. And again, this is kind of like, in 2009, to hear that fisheries were already seeing an impact was eye-opening for me. Well, we're now in a very different world, 15 plus years later. A global scientific study a couple of years ago estimated that 85% of the world's population, over 80% of the world's land area, had been impacted by climate change. The difference in those statistics is because there are big parts of our world where nobody lives, right? The Sahara Desert, right? We're being impacted by it. And if we just look back over the past 6 months, major world headlines, right? The fires in LA.
The fires in Canada, the floods in Virginia, in Vermont.
In Valencia, Spain, right? So we're seeing these impacts all around the world on a regular basis. And even in more maybe subtle or less episodic, less dramatic kind of single events, right? A hurricane or a flood or a fire garners a lot of attention. But if you're someone who's lived here in Falmouth and watched the beaches change over a matter of decades, if you're a farmer who has experienced weather getting more and more erratic and weather patterns changing over time, those changes are something that we actually have in common and might be a starting place for conversations. Again, let's put off the why are they happening. Let's put off the what do we have to do about it. We know those are the areas where we tend to get into disagreement. Maybe for a little while we can focus some of our conversations on what have you experienced and what have you seen change and how does that sit with you? Right? Are they good changes? Are they bad changes? Do you want to see more of that? Right? I think there's opportunity to connect just in what we are actually experiencing. And we know that, in fact, a majority of Americans, more than 2/3 of Americans, think climate change is happening, think that it's affecting Americans right now. And about 2/3 of Americans are alarmed or concerned about climate change. So there are a lot of people who are thinking about this. And I don't know if those statistics surprise you, but I don't feel like that's the story that we get told or what most people perceive to be.
I suppose it depends upon who makes the louder argument and how often they make that louder argument. If there's more people that are saying they deny what's happening, climate is just weather, this was going to happen anyway. I'm thinking of a situation where George's Bank out there off of the Boston Harbor, like hundreds of thousands of years ago, it used to be inhabited and it was a landmass out there, but it's not that way now. People actually lived there, but over time things have changed. So in some regards, people think of climate change as really just an extension of those types of changes. But it's different now, right? It's different now. And what makes it different now?
So it is, and you've hit on a really interesting point, especially here on the Cape. Because it is absolutely true that climate change, sea level rise, coastal erosion, these are literally the history of Cape Cod since its formation.
Yeah, we're built on sand.
It was glaciers advancing.
Yeah.
That's climate change. Glaciers advancing as we were getting cooler that brought the rocks and sand that are now the Cape and Islands here. And it was warming that caused those glaciers to retreat. And as they retreated, sea level started to rise. And it's been gradually over a period of close to 20,000 years that we went from, at first as the glaciers retreating, sea level was rising about 5 feet a century, right? And that slowed down to where it was about a foot a century.
But 5 feet a century, not 5 feet a year. And now
we're not seeing 5 feet a year now, but what we slowed down to was, first of all, over the past 10,000 years at a global level, our climate has been remarkably stable, and unusually so, if you look at the geological history, the deep history of the planet. So it's been really stable, and that's allowed us to do some really important things, like settle down and start doing agriculture and start developing cities. Literally, that stable culture is what has...
And grow populations.
That is what has enabled essentially the development of what we recognize as modern dominant societies, right? Here on Cape Cod, it's been over about the past 2,000 years that sea level rise has been its slowest. In the last 20,000 years, it's been a few inches per century, right? What we've done over the past, say, 150 years is dramatically increase the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, heat trapping gas, and we have now accelerated, well, so first of all, we're at a carbon dioxide level in our atmosphere right now that has not been seen in the entire evolutionary history of the human species. Right? So we're way beyond, it may have been replicated at some point in the deep past of the planet, but for human beings, we are at an unprecedented point in terms of the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. And in terms of coming back to the local and sea level rise here on the Cape, we're back in the area of right after the glaciers melted, of that several feet of sea level rise in a century being the rate that we're looking at right now. And that's not what we have been used to. And in the meantime, over the past several hundred years, we have built up our coastlines. We have put our homes and our towns and our roads in the way of the natural process of erosion and this accelerating process of sea level rise. And you put those together, and that's where you get the problem, right? So if we're talking about the National Seashore, and folks who work at the National Seashore have said to me before, yeah, I mean, we have a high rate of erosion and sea levels are rising, but it's not really a problem because the beach just moves. And with it, the National Seashore moves.
Which is all fine until you put a house nearby.
Until you have property lines and a structure, and those things don't move, right? So that's where we really get into trouble.
Maybe and people counted on there being enough time, like, you know, if you get 200 years, you know, chances are our family, you know, I mean, we have a lot of generational families here on the Cape, so 200 years may not be a particularly long period of time, but it, you know, it's a shorter period of time for considering what's happening.
Right. I mean, like I said, so if you've got rapid change, but no development, you're okay.
You're okay.
If you've got development and you've got a stable climate and a stable sea level, again,
okay, right.
That can hold for a while. Or if you've got that minimal amount of sea level rise, right? Like you get decades to centuries. It's the two combined where we've dramatically accelerated the changes happening at the coast, and we've put development right there at the coast, that suddenly we've got this conflict. And I think that's a really important thing to realize about climate change, not only in terms of coastal resilience, but across the board. The folks who say, well, climate has always changed, you know, the planet has still been here and we have still had life on Earth. Yes, we have also had 5 mass extinctions in the history of our planet. Life is still here, but it looks really different. We don't have any dinosaurs roaming the Earth anymore, right? And
unless
so
you count the birds.
The problem is that we're a little attached to the version of life on Earth as we know it.
We know it, sure.
Which is human beings and the societies that we've developed. And that is what is most at risk. Yes, other species are very much at risk and ecosystems are at risk, and we should be concerned about that. But the thing that's creating this real crisis for us is the impact on our societies and us.
But we can't forget that we are all part of the biodiversity. Like what kept the planet balanced for a lot of years, many years, was because of the biodiversity of all the species. And that we're not separate, you know, even though we have separated ourselves, we're not separate from, you know, the other species of this planet.
No, I'm glad you raised that, because I also don't want to make it sound like humans and human technology and societal development is the end of the story or the entirety of the story. Because absolutely we are part of an interconnected global biological and climate system. And we do often, too often I would say, frame climate change as this purely kind of economic and technological problem. And yes, the technologies that we are using, the fuels that we are using, we need to shift and use new technologies and different fuels. That's all true. but we often discount the role of the natural world in our climate system. And I will admit I was totally guilty of this for years, of thinking things like, well, we need to protect forests in order to help control climate change and address climate change. And I would go, I mean, yes, we need to protect forests, but really, is it going to do anything for our climate? And then I had to get educated and go look at the numbers and go, oh.
Yeah, it makes a big difference.
Right?
Yeah.
The way that we clear and use land is actually a quarter of the carbon pollution going into the atmosphere on a global basis. And as you already alluded to, forests and our oceans have been and are really critical pieces of the entire climate system. Right? We all learn in elementary school that we breathe out carbon dioxide and plants breathe in carbon dioxide. Well, between the ocean, mostly the tiny microscopic plants in the ocean and the great big trees and other plants on the land, they suck up almost 50% of greenhouse gas emissions from other human activities.
At one point, correct me if I'm wrong here, at one point though, they probably sucked up all of it because that's what kept us in balance. What has now happened is we've upset that balance because there's far more carbon dioxide going into the air than the natural world can keep up with. Like our oceans did a really good job for a long time. You know, I think it was kind of built into that system where, you know, maybe they knew this was going to happen. I don't know, but there was a big buffer there where they could keep sequestering carbon dioxide. But we've now reached a tipping point where the natural systems aren't keeping up because there's so much of it and because we're taking away those natural systems. We're cutting down the trees. We're polluting the oceans. You know, so they're not working as well as they used to work.
There's a lot to unpack in there. So first of all, you used this hot button phrase, tipping points, which frankly I try to avoid. Yes, there are points where, you know, say this particular ecosystem or this particular region or something flips in the way that it's working. But there are very few, you know, kind of clear-cut, hard and fast, like at this temperature, everything will cease and it will simply stop, right? The tipping point idea is this idea that there's like some cliff that we're gonna fall off and there's a point of no return. And actually a lot of the scientists I've talked to say, well, it's more like we're falling down a set of stairs. And we can actually grab the handrail, right? It's not just falling off a cliff. We can grab the handrail and potentially stop ourselves at a lot of different points. And the great thing about a set of stairs is you have the potential to maybe climb back up. Now, in terms of us climbing back up, in a climate sense, climbing back up, which is actually cooling back down, is going to take longer than any of us currently on this planet are going to see.
Of course.
But technically speaking, it is possible, right? The climate can shift in both directions, and we can clearly, as we've demonstrated over the past 150 years, control the amount of carbon in the atmosphere to a degree that we can change climate. So pulling the carbon back out of the atmosphere at the scale necessary is really, really challenging, right? The first thing we have to do, as you pointed out, is stop putting too much into the atmosphere. Because yes, until recently, our climate system was kind of the ultimate circular economy, right? On a grand scale, animals were putting out carbon dioxide, plants were taking in carbon dioxide. It
was all in balance.
One big happy circle,
right?
And yes, we've cut down a lot of forests. That both directly puts carbon into the atmosphere because half that wood, roughly, is carbon.
Right.
So if that gets burned or as the wood decays, that that's carbon that ends up in the atmosphere. And then on top of that,
with the trees gone, they lose their functionality to
pull we've lost the opportunity for those trees to pull carbon out of the atmosphere and lock it into their
double loss
into the wood. So it's a double loss there, and we've dramatically increased how much we're putting into the atmosphere. At the moment, the best technology that we have for removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere at scale is trees. So this is where my previous thinking that was kind of a quaint or a small scale solution, it's actually critical that we stop losing our forests, that we allow mature and old growth forests to stand and continue to mature, because the technologies that we're developing, and we should continue to develop those, but the technologies that we're developing, essentially these big kind of fans with filters to suck in air and trap the carbon that's in it out of the atmosphere.
It's like a man-made tree in a way.
Kind of.
Yeah.
It just, they take a lot more energy than a tree does. A tree does it with the energy from the sun. And those big
Unless
fans.
solar panel are powered or wind powered.
And solar and wind take space as well, right? So there's a lot to still be figured out there.
There's a lot of energy exchange.
Right, so we should absolutely, that's not to say that we should not work on the technologies and only focus on the trees. I think, as in many cases with climate change, we don't have the luxury of an either or. It has to be all of the above.
So with the trees being so essential to regaining or trying to get back to this balance on some level, one of those steps in the stairs going down, levels, why is there not, are there not more bans on cutting trees down, like deforestation of the Amazon? I don't know the numbers in particular, but the Amazon, if it was left untouched, could probably handle the CO2 that we have in the atmosphere now?
At this point, I mean, certainly with unchecked emissions, continuing to burn fossil fuels, there is no way that natural systems can make up that difference. And yeah, I don't think the Amazon by itself is going to take care of the whole world. What the Amazon and the other tropical forests together, though, right now are doing, even in their diminished state, because we've cleared land across all of our tropical rainforests, they're currently holding back about 1 degree C of warming. And I hesitate to even use that figure, because what does 1 degree Celsius of global average warming actually mean? Well, we're currently, the total is we've added about 1.5 degrees to date with our fossil fuel emissions, and we can see what that means in terms of the fluctuations in our climate, the severity of extreme weather events, right? If we were to lose all those forests, we'd add another degree of warming. So imagine what all of those impacts would be.
So what you're saying, with the current amount of forest
with the current forest that is,
and the current amount of CO2 that's being put into the air.
Yeah.
So I don't know, I'm kind of seeing a glimmer of hope, because we are working on reducing our carbon emissions. We know what causes. The two biggest contributors are, well, the big contributor are the fossil fuels, and then if you break that down, it's transportation, and it's the built environment, essentially, our homes, our buildings, our, those structures that have to be heated, right? So we've kind of got the answers. We just have to put it into action. I guess that's the real big question. That's why we're having conversations about this, is like.
So I want to go back to the part of your question that was, why do we keep cutting down forests?
Yeah.
Right? And the simple answer is because people need food, because people are striving for economic opportunities to take care of their families. We have to recognize that we can't just say, especially us sitting up here comfortably on Cape Cod, to a subsistence farmer or community member in the Amazon, or a traditional community member in the Democratic Republic of Congo, sorry, no more access to the forest. You can't cut down any more land, right? We have to find ways to meet the needs, advance the goals of those living in those places, and make, within our current economic and political systems, whether or not we like them, make those forests more valuable standing than they are cut down.
And still provide livelihoods for the people of those,
Absolutely.
of those areas. Yeah.
Now, those of us around the globe, especially when it comes to the Amazon, there's something we can all do in our daily lives to help influence the decisions that are made down there. Because yes, there are subsistence farmers and there are small-scale agricultural producers and there are indigenous communities. There's also a lot of really big agribusiness that's growing soy and ranging cattle that are for global markets for soy and beef. So we can all think about the food choices that we make on a daily basis. And this goes back to your, like, we know what the causes are. I think it's really important that when we think about the sources of emissions and the systems that we need to change, that rather than just thinking about it as fossil fuel or not, that we think about the aspects of our lives that are generating those emissions and how we change the way that we do those things, right? So heating and cooling, in particular, within our built environment, is a big energy draw.
But we're always going to need it, especially
Exactly.
here. We're always going to need it.
So we don't say we're not going to heat, we're not going to cool.
Right.
We need to find a different way
Right.
to heat and cool. Transportation is another big sector. We don't just say, we're going to stop moving around.
Right. We can't do that. No.
Right? Like, we want to get together and talk with each other. We want to go to work. We want to be able to travel.
Right.
Right. There are real benefits in terms of human connection and society and economy. So we need to change the way that we get around. And obviously, we're not going to stop eating.
No.
But food systems are a huge part, both of those land use, that quarter of emissions that comes from clearing land and from land. That's basically for making food, right? And then there's the rest of our food system with transportation and refrigeration and all that kind of stuff. We need to maybe find some different ways to eat. And in particular, for Americans who eat multiple times more meat than the World Health Organization says is actually healthy or necessary. You don't have to become vegetarian, you don't have to become vegan.
Yeah.
Eating lower on the food chain, eating less meat. Maybe it's cutting out 1 or 2 meals a week where meat is the main course and replacing that with a vegetable main course. Maybe that's just thinking about, okay, I'm going to have more of the vegetables on my plate and a smaller portion of the meat. I'm going to have less red meat and I'm going to have more chicken or fish, right? So there's a lot of ways to think about changing our diets that can be really, really beneficial. And for most Americans, changing the way that we eat could have as much of an effect on our carbon footprint as changing the way that we get around our transportation modes. I say that with a little bit of trepidation because I just used the carbon footprint phrase. Question for you. Do you know who popularized the idea of an individual carbon footprint?
I don't.
BP.
Ah, okay.
The idea of an individual carbon footprint and our individual responsibility for climate change was a deliberate effort by big oil to deflect blame to individuals. And while we all can and should be making choices that deliberately reflect our values, right? And I think that's a good way to think about what choices we should individually make. It's not only about carbon footprint, but making really values-aligned choices. We should all be doing that. We should all be pushing for systemic change as well. I think that's probably one of the most important things we can do at an individual level. We need to remember that we are working within systems. And we need to change those systems and change the options that are available to individuals. And that's not the responsibility of every individual in that system. So to use a success story from history, the ozone hole. Right? What was causing the ozone hole? CFCs and things like refrigerants and hairspray.
Right.
Going back to like, what's the source of the problem? Yes, the CFCs are the source of the problem. They're in refrigerants and in hairspray. What we did not do is say, well, we're just going to do away with refrigerators, or you need to find a different way to keep.
We found another way of being able to still have refrigerators.
And we did not put that responsibility on the individual consumer.
Right.
We said to the businesses producing refrigerators and hairspray, you have to give us different options. We haven't done that very well when it comes to saying you need to give us different options for how to heat and cool our house. You need to give us different options. We're starting to see with EVs, but that's not the end-all, be-all solution.
See with heat pumps.
We're starting to see it, right? But in a lot of cases, it's still framed around the individual responsibility for adoption. And
although I think the state of Massachusetts is going more and more towards like full electrification, whatever the word full actually means.
There's a lot more incentives out there, and especially here in Massachusetts, and we're super lucky in that regard, right? The fact that essentially anybody can get a free energy audit of their home, including renters, right? Can get an energy audit of their home and can get a large fraction of the costs of recommended changes paid for, right? That's incredible. We have incentives for solar panels. We have incentives for electric vehicles. I'm going to be honest, they're still expensive.
They are still expensive, yeah.
Right? It's not nothing. And so again, to say that this should entirely be on individuals to adopt this, as opposed to thinking about more systemic change, I think we need both, but I think we need to make sure that we keep that focus on the systemic level and on holding the major players in those systems accountable, not just putting all the responsibility on individuals.
And getting the right people in those positions to be able to make those types of decisions, whether it's in the private sector or the public sector, that are going to make those decisions for a systemic change. And we're fortunate in Massachusetts to have that with the current administration that we have.
Yeah. So I'm going to get political but not partisan for a minute, which is to say I think the single most important thing that any individual can do when it comes to climate change is vote. Vote like your life and the life of your loved ones depends on it, because they do. And what we've seen with climate change for at least 15 years that we've got really great public opinion polling data on a regular basis is, I already quoted you, the more than 2/3 of Americans are alarmed or concerned and know that it's happening. A majority of Americans say that the government should be doing more. Well over 2/3 support regulating carbon dioxide as a pollutant, support R&D on renewable energies, support tax incentives for the adoption of things like heat pumps and electric vehicles. It's over 8 in 10 Americans who support funding farmers to make our food systems part of the solution rather than part of the problem. We don't see that showing up in our representation in our voting.
I was just going to say, so the breakdown is it that not enough people are voting? Because if we just get to the voting part of it, I think there's really, at any given election, there's only about 30% of the population, correct me if I'm wrong, that actually votes, of voting age, right? So there's a lot more power there that could still be tapped into.
I think there's a few different things at work when we see that disconnect between what people will say in private to a pollster asking them questions and what shows up in the ballot box. Part of it is, we could see much higher participation rates, and in fact there's a project largely based out of Boston called the Environmental Voter Project that is entirely geared toward finding the people who are connected around environmental issues but not voting and getting them out to vote.
It's hard to imagine that people wouldn't be voting if they're
a lot of people are feeling really disenfranchised, right? So yes, getting out the vote, getting more people voting is important. But in addition to that, if you ask people, if pollsters ask people, just the straight up question, is climate change important? Should we be doing more about it? Yes. Okay, fine. We have finite resources. Your legislators and your government has limited time and resources. Rank the problems that they need to address. And while people think it's important and we should be doing more, climate change rarely makes the top 10. Because there are so many more immediate things that people are worried about in terms of their economic well-being, their physical and mental well-being, right? The infrastructure in their community. There are all these other things that end up in that top 10, and climate change doesn't, because
it's not in their immediate world.
It's slow moving.
Yeah.
And it's to some extent invisible until there's a fire or a flood
Yeah.
in
And
your
that's what
community.
works against climate change, is because on two aspects. As you said, it's slow moving, but it's moving faster than it has been. And the changes to affect positive change, to slow it down, to mitigate it more, actually do require some pre-planning and pre-actions now. Like you said, we're probably, if we could put into place an effective program and plan that we are going to reduce our emissions and we are going to have a more sustainable world, we have to start doing that now. We will not be the beneficiaries of this, but wouldn't it feel good if we could say we're heading in the right direction for those generations to come after us?
I would, yes to all of that. I would say we will not see the full benefits. We will see some benefits.
I think,
right?
Yeah, that's good. I'm really glad to hear that we will see some of the benefits. I would be really pleased if there was this general like-mindedness, this consensus that when we make decisions about, development that has to go up somewhere, or the type of car that is available for us to use for transportation or heat source or whatever, that it's made with in mind, what is the impact? Is this going to reduce our carbon emissions? Is this going to reduce the negative impact on our present world, our Cape Cod, and on our world in general? That would be, like, if that was in place, maybe that's a little too idealistic. If that was in place, I could sleep better at night. I'd feel better for my grandkids because.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Our political and economic systems are not well practiced at long-term thinking. And that needs to shift.
Is that a behavioral thing of us? I guess it is really.
I think a lot of it is human nature, but it's the systems that we've built, right? It's the incentive systems that we've built that are very, very short term, and so it's hard.
Well,
we've built systems
faster.
that make it. We've built systems that make it harder to do the right thing for the long term, or to even consider the long term. I feel like there's another thing that we often get wrong in the way that we weigh the options in front of us. And this shows up over and over in the climate space, which is we say, okay, so we want to shift to EVs. To introduce EVs and build the infrastructure necessary is going to cost us X trillions of dollars over the next 10 years. Right. And we silently assume that if we don't do that, the cost is nothing.
Exactly, but it's not.
In actual fact, we need to be comparing that cost to the cost of doing nothing, which is both the economic costs of just producing a different kind of cars, but is actually the cost of the climate impacts that come with that.
Right.
And we don't. Yes, there are ways to calculate these things. It's not so much that we can't come up with that information. We just tend not to
look there.
Right.
Yeah.
And so. I hate to put it in these terms in some regards, but instead of kind of doing just a cost-benefit analysis, we need to be doing a cost-cost analysis, right? And then making a choice. This is the cost, these are the benefits we'll get. This is the cost, these are the benefits we'll get, or these are the impacts that we will feel. And compare apples to apples instead of assuming that what we're currently doing has no cost.
If we spend
and the
nothing
new thing
on it,
has
we're
all
saving
cost.
money. If we spend nothing on climate,
Well, to say
mediation or mitigation, we're saving.
It's a false comparison because
It's not.
say if we spend nothing on this new thing, we're spending nothing. That's not true.
No.
Right? We're spending on things currently.
Yeah.
And that has ramifications. And what we're spending a lot of money on is natural disasters. Right?
And insurance.
More than 20 natural or unnatural climate-fueled disasters last year in the United States that cost over $1 billion. Right? NOAA tracks billion-dollar disasters, those that incur more than $1 billion of damage. And the number of those has been growing, and the current total over their data on billion-dollar disasters is something like, I think it's $1.7 trillion, right? So then if you tally up those costs, and then you compare that to, okay, well, we're going to spend 1.7 trillion to put this new thing in place that over the course of 20 years will mitigate disasters. You know, this is a combination of the long-term thinking you're talking about, because those costs and benefits aren't going to be realized in the next year,
Right.
or even in the years when that money is spent. But we need to be thinking about the costs of action as well as the costs of inaction, and we need to be thinking about that over really long time frames. And then I guess I would say the third shift that I think we really need in our decision-making systems is we need to stop thinking about climate change as this standalone thing over here. Mm-hmm. As we've already talked about, climate change is caused by and climate change impacts essentially every aspect of our lives. It is a factor, or should be a factor, in our decision-making about housing, about transportation, about food, about everything, essentially. It's not a standalone over here to be treated separately and addressed kind of in a silo. It's something that should really be integrated.
Into
so
every
that
process,
right,
every decision making.
So that when we're thinking about here in the town of Falmouth where to put housing or how to build housing, right, we should be thinking about what is the cost in terms of trees that might be cut down, or you know, it does show up in terms of we have guidance to incentivize, essentially, and show more support for projects that include things like renewable energy, right? So that's great. We could also be thinking about what's the footprint, what's the cost in climate terms of that development.
There have been some changes, positive changes, I think, made, like, for instance, with regards to construction. Falmouth has, they have opted into a special building code. There is an ultra special building code, which they have either yet made a decision on, or I'm not exactly sure where they stand on that. Maybe you have an understanding where that is. So to me, I kind of see that as a step in the right direction. I see, like, for instance, the affordable housing that is going up. You know, they're going up with heat pumps. In some cases, there's solar that's being put on. I'm not exactly sure whether they're taking into consideration, like, how many trees they cut down, but there seem to be, like, trees that are or if they put a development in one area, there's some sort of arrangement made with another area is left completely untouched into perpetuity. You know, it goes with the our Conservation Commission, if I'm saying that correctly. So it seems like Falmouth has they're maybe a little bit more aware of when they make decisions that we should take this into consideration. Would you say that's true? And what other examples would you have for Falmouth?
I think that's absolutely fair. And at the same time, I think there's more that we could be doing to ensure that factor, that climate factor, is integrated into our decision making more systemically, more formally, I guess.
Mm-hmm. What would it look like?
When a department is submitting a budget item, in addition to, you know, how does this align with our strategic plan? What are the climate impacts of pursuing this path forward for this project, right? Benefits or impacts, right?
And there's a model. Is there a model that they could use to determine what that climate impact is, or is that something that would have to be developed?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think the answer really depends, because, as I've said, the nature of the climate benefits or the climate impacts could be so varied. So is there a calculator out there when you can plug anything into and get what's the climate ramifications out of it? No. You know, there are different models that might tell you what the carbon value of a piece of forest is versus what the difference between having gas cars and hybrid cars and EV cars for a certain amount of activity would be, right? So you're right, it's not easy. It's not necessarily an easy ask at the moment to do that.
And to your point, it wouldn't just be what's the difference in the carbon emissions, but what's the cost of it, right?
It could, I think that there's a lot of room to shape what that actually would mean. And I should say also in terms of, kind of the progress that we're making here in Falmouth, that while climate change should be, in my opinion, integrated into all of our decision making, it is not everyone's expertise. And so having some dedicated expertise and staff time to address these issues and help everybody integrate is really, really important. And we currently have that in a sustainability coordinator, Stephanie Madsen, who's fabulous. And we're working on adding a coastal resilience specialist, right?
How's the progress been on that?
We had some challenges in the first round of recruiting, but the second round of recruiting right now seems very promising. So hoping that we'll have someone on board soon. And that's really important to have. Again, I keep coming back to this. We don't have the luxury of an either or. We're going to need some dedicated staff time and thought and expertise, and we need it integrated into all of our systems. And in part, that dedicated expertise and that person sitting within town government can help with everybody else integrating that.
Sort of help with sort of changing that way of looking at things.
Yep.
Yeah. The town also back in 2020 declared a climate emergency. In 2024, they adopted the Rights of Nature resolution, which I think are both very positive things for the town. Could you explain what they are, and do they, speaking to what things influence the decision-making process in town, are they speaking to our members of the board with regards to the strategic plan for the town?
I would say what those resolutions primarily speak to is declaring more of a mindset than like a strategic action plan, right? And so this is where kind of that whole of government approach and integrating these ideas formally into decision-making processes, I think, is something that we could still stand to work on.
Can we expect there to be any changes with regards to some of the changes that are coming down from the federal level to affect what we can do as a community here in Falmouth or even on the Massachusetts level? Because I feel a little bit like we're very fortunate. We kind of live in this bubble of, we haven't stopped thinking about climate change just because there's a different thought process elsewhere. But it can be impactful. So are we seeing, we are seeing some changes with regards to, the firings that have happened with many of the scientists in Woods Hole. Is there some talk that there's incentives that are going to be taken away as far as EVs? So what's your understanding at this point in time?
Yeah, so absolutely our science community here in Falmouth is already feeling impacts and expects more in terms of reduction in force in the federal workforce, cuts in the federal workforce, and potential impacts on federal research funding. But I would say more than anything, what we have at the moment is massive uncertainty, right? Even where we've seen actions at the federal level, the situation's just been really volatile. We've seen a decision and then a reversal and then a modification. And so I really hesitate to get into specifics of what impacts we might see because right now I think the biggest impact is really just that there's a lot of uncertainty. And that in and of itself can be detrimental. Right, can inhibit action both in private sector and with individuals. If there's economic uncertainty, then people start to pull back on bigger investments potentially. Right. You know, I was a reporter at the climate talks in Paris in 2015, where the Paris Climate Agreement was formed, and I talked with business leaders who were there. And I said, why are you here? And what are you hoping to get out of this agreement? Mm. And the biggest answer I got was certainty. It may not even be the direction that we want to go, but if we know the direction that the international community is going, we can plan for that and make a business plan.
Right.
Right. So I think at the moment, the biggest thing we're seeing is uncertainty impacting decision making, even if there hasn't been a direct, formal, confirmed impact.
So what can we do? You know, we have very good representatives on the state level that are in support of continuing this effort to reduce our carbon emissions, right? What can we do to help them? We talked about voting for sure, but is there something more specific? I feel like we've got really good cheerleaders, but they could use additional help. What would that look like?
So, you know, it's interesting where my mind immediately went is less focused on our elected leadership and more focused on each other. So I've given you all the statistics about the majority of Americans that are concerned and support solutions. A similar majority, 2/3 majority. And by the way, the reason I keep harping on a 2/3 majority, I think it's really powerful to think about if those majorities were reflected in our elected representatives. A 2/3 majority, a supermajority, is what's needed to amend the Constitution. Right? If that majority in public opinion were reflected in elected leadership, we might be in a very different position. So that's the importance of the voting part. But a similar majority say that they talk about climate change never or rarely.
Wow. So it was a good thing
so this
we
is a complete anomaly, right? And those difficult conversations that you were talking about. I know, I live in a bubble where I'm like, really?
No.
I talk about climate change all day, every day. Most people do not. And I think most people are really scared to, because it might open up a divide with someone that they need to work with, or that's a dear friend or a family member. I would say if we've got this majority concern, you might be surprised what you find on the other end of that conversation, and what we leave on the table when we don't talk to each other and we don't know that we actually have this majority and we don't know who else is supporting it, is that a lot of us are sitting at home worried and feeling alone.
Yeah.
And there's nothing worse than feeling like you're alone with your problems. So if we were talking to each other, some of these answers of like, what do we do and how do we support our legislators and some of those might just resolve themselves if we were actually having those conversations with each other.
Sometimes just talking about things makes you feel better about it. When you can feel better about it, it might give you the incentive to want to like do something more about it. Or just feeling better about it would feel good. You know what I mean? Like that would be a great
And there's nothing wrong, contrary to popular opinion, there's nothing wrong with feeling good. Yeah. And actually, because I'm a science geek, I have to bring it back. There's actually science, like that feeling good, what you're saying, is actually really powerful. Because yes, when we feel like we have some agency, like there is some possibility, we'll go and do things. And people often ask me, okay, so should our community, or should I change my diet, or should I change my car, or should I put solar panels on? I'm trying to figure out what would be most effective for me to do.
Sometimes that feeling of what can I do to be most effective makes us not do anything, because it's like, what is that most? Well, just do something, just one little thing.
You stole my line, right? Like, do what feels best, do what comes most easily. Because, and even if it's the smallest thing, right? Because that feeling of accomplishment actually turns into motivation. It turns into fuel to take on other bigger things.
Right.
The other thing that our personal actions do, and I know I kind of was, I don't mean to be dismissive of individual action and individual change, it's important. But the biggest importance that I see in individual action is not necessarily in the decrease in your carbon footprint and my carbon footprint. It's that you're essentially communicating in a certain way. You're talking about climate change with those around you by changing your behavior or by changing the way that your house looks by putting solar panels on top of it, and you're normalizing that. Because whether or not we think that we are independent thinkers and not subject to peer pressure, human beings are by nature pretty conformist.
Yes.
We want to be part of the group.
Yeah.
We don't want to stand out.
Right.
And so when we take these actions and we start to make it visible that, oh, she's doing something and she's doing, oh, maybe it's not as, I'm not
Bad
by
as it
myself
is, or
and it's
maybe
not
it's
as
not
weird
that
as I
hard to
think it
do.
is.
Yeah.
It's not that hard. We start to normalize that. And that in and of itself reduces the barrier to both individual and social change. And so in that regard, I think individual action is really, really important. And sometimes those changes, again, can be really tiny. I didn't bring it with me today, but for years, I've been drinking out of mason jars with little sippy lids that I can buy for a few bucks. It's not a big expensive water bottle. I've got tons of them at home, you know, so it's not plastic. And I started showing up to like public events or to meetings with my jar.
Yeah.
And people would go,
Of course.
huh, that's interesting. Where do you get those lids? How much do they cost? They're a few bucks. They're made in Somerville, Mass. It's a great little product, right?
Yeah.
It normalized the idea that, oh, we don't all have to be carrying around a plastic water bottle.
Right. And we don't have to have a $60 or $70 plastic water bottle either.
Or a $60 or $70 metal one. And I've got plenty of the metal ones at home too, you know, nothing against those. Like, but just that little change and actually showing up with something a little bit different can spark a conversation and can get people thinking that, oh, well, I could make a change too.
So our individual behaviors can make a difference because it then becomes seen and talking more about it. Like, you know, that's how we started our conversation today was, let's have those conversations. Ask people about how they feel about climate change, or tell them about some of the things that you do, or whatever it is, but just let's talk about it some more.
And I think one thing you said in there, yes, let's talk about it more and ask questions.
Yeah.
Don't just have conversations that are aimed at telling someone else what you think and where you think they're wrong.
It has to be two-sided or three-sided or six-sided, whatever it is.
Go in trying to understand where they're coming from.
Exactly.
And it's actually been shown that just exploring ideas together and asking questions can actually lead to more change in ideas and change in behavior than trying to tell somebody to do it. None of us like to be told what to do. And it can change your own thinking too. So ask questions.
Okay. I think that's a really good place to begin. We're not going to stop, but a really good place to begin. Heather, I want to thank you so much. This has been wonderful. And to those of you that are watching us out there, let's have some more conversations about climate change and how it affects your lives and how we can make it better and how we can do it all together. If you'd like more information, please contact us at falmouthcan at gmail.com. Thank you so much for joining us.